Hey, you ever just look up at the stars and think about how long humans have been doing that? Generations upon generations, gazing at the same night sky, wondering about our place in it all. It's kind of mind-blowing when you really let it
It,
sink in.
it truly is that deep-seated curiosity, that urge to understand our own journey. It's something that connects us across millennia. And that's really what brings us together for this deep dive to explore Yuval Noah Harari's Sapiens, which you could almost think of as our shared human campfire story.
Exactly. Sapiens isn't just some, dusty history book. It's this sweeping look at the major turning points, the big revolutions that have made us who we are today.
Yeah, we're talking about the cognitive revolution, the agricultural revolution, and the scientific revolution. These massive shifts that have fundamentally changed what it means to be human.
And for you, our listener, our goal today is to really get into the heart of these revolutions, to unpack the most fascinating and frankly, sometimes surprising ideas that Harari puts forward.
We want to connect the dots in a way that feels both thorough and gives you those aha moments, without ever feeling overwhelming or like a lecture.
Definitely no lectures here. We're just two friends around a metaphorical campfire, sharing some of the most interesting and thought-provoking nuggets we've found in our deep dive into Sapiens. So, with a story this huge, where do we even begin to make sense of it all?
Well, a logical starting point, and where Harari himself begins, is by looking at the vast stretch of time before our current dominance. For the overwhelming majority of their existence, we're talking close to 2 million years, prehistoric humans were really just another type of mammal.
Not particularly special.
Not really, no, just sort of part of the landscape, not calling the shots.
It's almost humbling to think about, isn't it?
Shit.
For eons, we weren't running the planet. We were just there.
Hmm.
Then, relatively recently, geologically speaking, just around maybe 100,000 years ago, Homo sapiens made this incredibly rapid climb to the top of the food chain.
Yeah, it's like we went from being, someone's potential lunch to the top predator almost overnight in evolutionary terms.
Right.
And Harari suggests this sudden ascent might have actually left a kind of psychological scar. Think about it. Most creatures at the top of the food chain, lions, sharks, they got there gradually over vast stretches of time. Their instincts, their biology, evolved to fit that role.
They grew into it.
Exactly. We, on the other hand, made this incredibly quick jump. Perhaps that helps explain some of the anxiety and stress that seems so common in the human experience. We're still maybe adjusting to being at the top, like ecological parvenus.
That's a really interesting way to frame it. It's like our ancient wiring hasn't quite caught up with our modern status. Speaking of ancient times, one of the really key developments was the discovery and mastery of fire and then cooking. That must have been a huge game changer, right?
Oh, absolutely. Massive. The ability to cook food is believed to have played a crucial role in our biological development. Cooked food is much easier to digest.
Right. You get more energy out of it.
Precisely. Which meant our bodies could spend less energy on digestion, think smaller intestinal tracts, and divert more resources towards developing those big, energy-hungry brains of ours. It might have even led to our smaller teeth and jaws compared to other primates.
Brains that would eventually lead us to, no less. But the story of how Homo sapiens became the only human species left on the planet is pretty complex, involving our interactions with other human species like the Neanderthals.
There were a couple of main ideas about how that played out, weren't there?
Yes, the two main models are the interbreeding theory, the idea that as Homo sapiens spread out of Africa, we mixed with existing human populations in other regions.
Like Neanderthals in Europe, Denisovans in Asia.
Right. And the other main one is the replacement theory, which suggests we mostly replaced them, perhaps outcompeted them, maybe even violently, without significant mixing.
So which one is it?
Well, like a lot of things in science, the reality seems to be messier. It's likely a combination of both. There's probably some level of interbreeding. We see Neanderthal DNA in modern non-African populations after all, about 1–4%.
Roughly, yeah. But there was probably also a significant degree of replacement happening, too. It wasn't necessarily a simple story.
So it wasn't just one species neatly wiping out the others. There was interaction, coexistence for a time. And the story of the Neanderthals is particularly fascinating. Harari uses that quote, something like, "They were too familiar to ignore, but too different to tolerate." That really makes you think.
It does. Archaeological and genetic evidence indicates that Homo sapiens and Neanderthals coexisted in Eurasia for thousands of years, maybe around 6,000 to 7,000 years in some areas.
That's a long time to live side by side.
It is. And we know interbreeding occurred perhaps around 47,000 years ago, based on some ancient genomes. They were similar enough that they would have likely competed for the same resources, maybe even recognized each other as, well, people in some sense, but also differently enough that it might have led to friction, misunderstanding, and ultimately the Neanderthals' disappearance.
And then there are the Denisovans, who are a much more recent discovery in the grand story of human evolution, right?
Right.
Found from just a tiny bone.
That's what's so remarkable. We initially identified them from a single tiny finger phalanx, a piece of finger bone, found in Denisova Cave in Siberia. That's it.
Incredible.
But the genetic analysis of that bone revealed a whole new branch of the human family tree related to Neanderthals, but distinct. And their genetic influence is surprisingly widespread.
Where do we see it?
We now know they interbred with the ancestors of modern humans, too. Their DNA makes up a noticeable chunk, maybe 3% to 5% of the genetic makeup of modern-day people in near Oceania.
So populations in New Guinea, Australia, some islands.
Exactly. And interestingly, traces of Denisovan ancestry have also been found, albeit at lower levels, in East Asians and Native Americans. This suggests they were much more widely distributed across Asia than just Siberia.
So if you have roots in those parts of the world, you carry a small piece of this long-lost human lineage. It's just incredible how ancient DNA, some of it tens of thousands of years old, is constantly rewriting our understanding of human evolution and how we adapted.
Absolutely. It really shows you how much we're still learning about our own deep history. Every new find can shift the picture.
And it makes that whole question of species definition pretty fuzzy, doesn't it? If Homo sapiens and Neanderthals and Denisovans could interbreed and have kids who then had kids, were they really separate species?
That's the ongoing debate. One key biological definition of a species is reproductive isolation. Can two groups interbreed and produce fertile offspring? The fact that we have evidence of successful interbreeding complicates that definition in our case.
Even if they looked quite different.
Even if, fossils from, say, 100,000 years ago show some pretty pronounced physical differences between sapiens and Neanderthals. But the gene flow suggests the biological barrier wasn't absolute, at least for a while. So were they subspecies, different populations? It's still debated.
Okay, so we have these early humans interacting, sometimes mixing, sometimes replacing, and eventually Homo sapiens becomes the only player left on the field. What was the big turning point? Harari talks about the cognitive revolution happening somewhere between, 70,000 and 30,000 years ago. What was so revolutionary about it?
The cognitive revolution marks a really crucial point where Homo sapiens seems to have developed a unique kind of language. It wasn't just about communicating basic needs or dangers like, look out, lion.
Which other animals can do.
Right. This new ability was about talking about things that aren't physically present, things you can't see, touch, or smell, abstract concepts.
Like myths, legends, gods, spirits, even things like justice or tribal identity.
Exactly. The ability to gossip is often mentioned too, understanding complex social relationships. But crucially, it's the ability to talk about fiction, about things that exist purely in the imagination.
So suddenly, we could not only warn each other about a real saber-toothed tiger, but also invent elaborate stories about spirit animals or where the world came from or what happens after death. That sounds like a massive leap.
It absolutely was, because this ability to create and share these imagined stories, these fictions, is what allowed Homo sapiens to cooperate on a scale never seen before in the animal kingdom.
How so?
Well, think about other social animals like chimpanzees. Their group sizes tend to be limited, maybe around 50 individuals or so.
Because cooperation depends on knowing everyone personally, like grooming politics.
Pretty much. It's based on intimate personal relationships and direct knowledge of each other. Humans, however, thanks to shared myths and stories, could form much larger and more flexible groups. They could cooperate with thousands, even millions of strangers, as long as they believed in the same gods, the same nation, the same company, the same money.
So that's where the idea of imagined realities or social constructs comes in. Things like nations, corporations, human rights, money. They aren't tangible things in the physical world.
Precisely. They exist only in our collective imagination. But they aren't lies in the traditional sense, because as long as the entire group, or a critical mass, believes in them, they have very real power and shape our behavior.
So we act as if France exists, or as if this piece of paper is worth 5 pounds.
Exactly. Ever since the cognitive revolution, humans have essentially lived in a kind of dual reality. The objective physical world of rocks, trees, and rivers, and this parallel subjective world built on our shared imagination.
And what's incredibly powerful about this, Harari argues, is that you can change the way people cooperate and organize themselves simply by changing the stories they believe.
Yeah.
You don't need to wait for slow genetic evolution.
Right. You can have a revolution just by convincing people to believe in a new story, a new god, a new political ideology, a new economic theory. This kind of rapid behavioral adaptation is unique to us.
It's like we're the only animal that can engage in mass-scale make-believe, and that make-believe has really concrete, real-world consequences. And Harari also points out something interesting, that humans living, say, 30,000 years ago had the same fundamental capabilities as we do today.
That's a key point. Physically, emotionally, and intellectually, those early Homo sapiens who painted cave walls and hunted mammoths were essentially just like us. Their brains were the same size, same structure.
So it wasn't like our brains suddenly got better in some basic biological way during the cognitive revolution.
The consensus seems to be no, not in terms of raw hardware. It was more about the software, the way we learn to use our brains, especially through this new kind of language and shared fiction. This raises some really interesting questions about why certain developments like agriculture or widespread writing took so much longer to appear. It wasn't due to a lack of inherent intelligence.
It's also mentioned that Homo sapiens are the only animals that conduct trade, right? Is that linked to this cognitive shift too?
It seems likely, yeah. Trade often involves abstract concepts of value, trust between strangers, perhaps agreements about future exchange, all things that rely on this ability to think beyond the immediate and concrete and share those abstract ideas.
Okay, so before we get to agriculture, these cognitively modern humans lived as foragers, as hunter-gatherers for tens of thousands of years. What can we actually tell about their societies? There's a bit of a debate among anthropologists about how they were structured, isn't there?
There is. You get different schools of thought. Some lean towards the idea of a more communal, perhaps more egalitarian, ancient commune model. Others suggest something closer to the eternal monogamy model with more defined nuclear family structures.
And the evidence is tricky.
Very tricky. We don't have written records, obviously. We rely mostly on archaeological finds, fossils, stone tools, remnants of campsites. And it's important to remember that the popular term Stone Age can be a bit misleading.
You said they used other materials, too.
Exactly. Many, maybe even most, of their tools and artifacts were likely made of wood, bone, plant fibers, leather, things that just don't preserve well over millennia compared to stone. So we're probably seeing a very biased picture based on what survived.
Makes sense. And these forager bands, were they generally quite isolated?
That seems to be the general picture, yeah. Small bands, maybe a few dozen people, relatively nomadic within a territory. They were generally quite self-sufficient.
Not a lot of interaction or trade between different groups.
Probably not for essential goods. There might have been occasional large gatherings, maybe some exchange of decorative items like shells, or finding mates from other bands. But mostly they seem to have lived in relative isolation from other groups, and the overall population density was incredibly low compared to what came later.
How low are we talking?
Harari estimates the entire global human population before agriculture was likely smaller than the population of, say, modern-day Cairo, just scattered across the entire planet.
Wow. Now, it's fascinating that some experts have described these forager societies as the original affluent societies.
Mm-hmm.
That really goes against the common image of a constant, brutal struggle for survival, doesn't it?
It does challenge that stereotype. The argument is based on evidence suggesting they often had quite varied and nutritious diets, much more varied than early farmers, actually.
Eating whatever was available seasonally.
Right. Nuts, berries, roots, insects, fish, game. And studies of modern foragers suggest they might have actually spent fewer hours working, hunting, and gathering than typical peasants or modern office workers.
No, more leisure time.
Potentially, yes. And they likely suffered less from infectious diseases because small nomadic groups don't create the same conditions for epidemics as crowded villages do.
But it wasn't a paradise either, right? Harari is careful to point that out.
Definitely not. We shouldn't romanticize it. Life expectancy was likely low, mainly due to incredibly high rates of child mortality. Accidents, animal attacks, infections could easily be fatal. And social life wasn't necessarily harmonious.
What kind of downsides are we talking about?
Well, evidence from some contexts and observations of some more recent forager groups suggest practices that seem harsh to us. Things like abandoning the elderly or disabled if they couldn't keep up with the band, occasional infanticide, possibly violence between groups. Even rare instances of ritual sacrifice can't be ruled out entirely.
So a much more complex picture There were benefits, but also real hardships and maybe social cruelty too.
Exactly. And we even see hints of potential social hierarchy. There's an amazing burial site called Sungyur in Russia, dating back about 30,000 years. It has these skeletons, including children, buried with thousands of ivory beads, elaborate clothing, spears.
That doesn't sound very egalitarian.
It certainly suggests that even back then, some individuals or families might have had higher status or wealth than others. So the idea of a perfectly equal ancient commune might be too simplistic. The truth is, piecing together a complete picture of forager life is incredibly difficult because the evidence is so patchy. Harari calls it a curtain of silence.
A curtain of silence. I like that. Now, shifting gears slightly, but still before agriculture, what kind of impact did these pre-agricultural Homo sapiens, even in their small numbers, have on their environment? You wouldn't necessarily think they could do much damage.
You might not, but it turns out they might have had a more significant impact than we initially imagined, especially on large animals, the megafauna.
Like woolly mammoths, giant sloths, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Harari highlights the wave of extinctions that often followed the arrival of Homo sapiens in new landmasses. Australia is a key example. Around 45,000 years ago, not long after humans arrived, most of its large animals disappeared.
And the argument is that humans were responsible.
It's a strong hypothesis. He points out that there weren't similar widespread extinctions in the oceans at the same time, which makes climate change a less likely sole culprit for the land extinctions.
Okay.
And then you see a similar pattern when humans reached the Americas, or later places like New Zealand or Madagascar. Megafauna extinctions seem to coincide pretty closely with human arrival.
So even with relatively simple tools, our ancestors were formidable hunters.
It seems so, especially arriving in lands where the animals had never encountered humans before and hadn't evolved defenses. A combination of hunting and perhaps landscape changes through fire use could have been devastating for large, slow-reproducing species. It's the first big wave of human-caused ecological disruption.
Which brings us, then, to the next huge revolution, the agricultural revolution. Starting around, 12,000 years ago, this is often presented as the great leap forward for humanity, the dawn of civilization. But Harari offers a really different, much more critical perspective, doesn't he?
He certainly does. It's one of the most famous arguments in Sapiens. He challenges the common idea that agriculture led to an easier, better, or more fulfilling life for the average person, or even that it made us smarter.
He argues foragers already knew nature really well.
Exactly. They had an incredibly deep and nuanced understanding of plants and animals. The shift wasn't about gaining new knowledge initially. Harari argues that, from the perspective of the average human, the agricultural revolution was, in many ways, a fraud.
A fraud. That's a strong word. Why?
Because while it did lead to a much larger total amount of food being produced, which allowed for population explosions.
Or people, basically.
Right, more Homo sapiens units. But for the individual farmer, life often became harder. They typically worked longer hours than foragers.
Clearing fields, planting, weeding, harvesting, hauling water.
All that backbreaking labor. And their diets often became much less varied and less nutritious, relying heavily on just one or two staple crops like wheat, rice, or potatoes.
Which could lead to nutritional deficiencies and disaster if that one crop failed.
Precisely. So more work, often a worse diet, more vulnerability to famine, and also because people were living in permanent, denser settlements, more susceptibility to infectious diseases.
So why did we do it then, if it was such a bad deal for the average person?
Well, that leads to another fascinating idea. Maybe we didn't domesticate wheat, rice, and potatoes. Maybe they domesticated us.
How does that work?
Look at it from the perspective of wheat. Before agriculture, it was just one wild grass among many confined to a small region in the Middle East. After agriculture, it spread to cover vast areas of the globe, becoming one of the most successful plants in history.
So it used us to conquer the world.
In a way, yes. We cleared forests, removed competing plants, protected it from pests, provided water, all to help wheat reproduce. We fundamentally changed our lifestyles, our bodies even, to serve the needs of these plants. It's a different perspective on evolutionary success.
And we got trapped in this. Harari calls it the luxury trap, right?
Yeah, that's the mechanism he proposes. It probably didn't happen overnight. Maybe it started small, people settled down a bit to tend some promising wild green patches. It made life slightly easier temporarily. They could store a bit more food.
Have slightly more kids survive.
Exactly, but then the population grew. What was once a small convenience became a necessity to feed the extra mouths. People had to work harder to cultivate more land. Luxuries gradually became necessities, creating new obligations, and the workload just kept increasing over generations. It's a cycle that's hard to escape once you're in it.
A cycle of working harder, but not necessarily being happier or healthier.
That's the argument.
Yeah.
And the shift to settled villages also directly impacted population growth. Women could have children more frequently when they weren't constantly on the move. But this also meant, as we said, higher rates of disease spreading and probably still high child mortality, just concentrated in settlements.
And then there's the whole story of animal domestication, sheep, goats, pigs, chickens. Harari calls our relationship with them a Faustian bargain. What does he mean by that?
It means we gained a lot of reliable sources of meat, milk, wool, hides, muscle power for plowing. But the cost, especially for the animals themselves, has often been immense. We didn't just tame them. We fundamentally altered them through selective breeding over generations. We bred them to be more docile, more productive for our needs, often suppressing their natural instincts and social behaviors.
And their living conditions.
Often became, and certainly are today in industrial farming, incredibly harsh. Confined spaces, restricted movement, separation of mothers and young. From the perspective of the individual animal, domestication has often been a catastrophe, even if the species as a whole proliferated.
That's a really sobering thought. And the agricultural revolution also brought other changes, like worrying more about the future.
Yes, that's another key point. Foragers mostly lived in the present. Farmers became intensely focused on the future. Will it rain? Will the harvest be good? Will we have enough stored to survive the winter? This constant anxiety about unpredictable future events became a central part of the agricultural mindset.
And all this surplus food, when there was a surplus, it didn't just feed the farmers, did it?
No, that surplus is what enabled the development of complex societies. It could support specialists who didn't farm: priests, soldiers, artisans, kings, administrators. It laid the foundation for villages, towns, cities, kingdoms, empires.
But the farmers themselves often didn't see much benefit.
Very often, no. Throughout much of history, the agricultural surplus produced by peasants through hard labor was appropriated by rulers and elites who lived off their work. Peasants rarely achieved the economic security they might have craved when they first settled down.
Which leads us directly into this really important concept Harari explores: imagined orders and the development of social hierarchies. Once you have these larger settled societies built on agricultural surplus, you inevitably get structures of power and inequality, right?
Yes, because large-scale cooperation, as we discussed, requires these shared myths, these imagined realities. And very often, these imagined realities include justifications for why society should be structured in a certain way, usually with some people on top and others at the bottom.
He uses some striking examples, like Hammurabi's Code from ancient Babylon and the American Declaration of Independence.
Right. They seem completely different, one enshrining hierarchy, superiors, commoners, slaves, as divinely ordained, the other proclaiming that all men are created equal.
But Harari's point is,
His point is that both are based on principles that exist only in the shared imagination of humans. Neither hierarchy nor equality is an objective biological reality. They are imagined orders. There's no scientific proof that some people are inherently superior or that everyone is biologically identical in capabilities or rights. These are stories we tell ourselves about how society should be organized.
and keeping these stories alive requires effort. It's not automatic.
Absolutely not. Maintaining an imagined order requires constant and often strenuous efforts. It requires education, mythology, rituals, art, propaganda, and often violence and coercion to deal with those who don't accept the story.
And these hierarchies, whether based on class, free persons versus slaves, caste, race, whites versus blacks, wealth, rich versus poor, or gender, they tend to present themselves as natural and inevitable, don't they?
Exactly. They always claim to be rooted in some objective reality, in nature or the will of the gods, rather than admitting they are fictional constructs. This naturalization makes the hierarchy seem legitimate and harder to challenge.
He uses the example of the racial hierarchy in America quite effectively.
Yes, he points out how the enslavement of Africans was initially driven largely by circumstantial economic factors, availability, disease resistance, existing slave trade networks. But over time, an elaborate imagined hierarchy was constructed, based on pseudoscientific racist theories, to justify it and make it seem natural that black people were suited for enslavement and white people for mastery.
A story created to justify an existing power structure.
Precisely. And when we consider the division between men and women, it becomes perhaps even more complex and debated. Is the near universal prevalence of patriarchy throughout history based purely on imagined stories, or does it have deeper biological roots?
There are obvious biological differences between sexes, of course.
Clearly. But the crucial question Harari raises is whether those biological differences in average physical strength, or perhaps hormonal influences on aggression or nurturing, actually justify the vast social, political, and economic inequalities between men and women that have existed in most societies.
Do biology and culture get mixed up?
They inevitably do. Some theories suggest evolution might have favored certain traits in men, like aggression or ambition, due to competition for reproduction, the patriarchal genes idea. But even if there are some biological predispositions, it's a huge leap to say they necessitate or justify men holding almost all positions of power or women being confined to certain roles. Culture plays a massive role in amplifying or suppressing any potential biological differences.
And he also points out that all these imagined orders, all human cultures, are actually filled with internal contradictions.
Yes, that's a fascinating point. Think about modern Western culture championing both equality and liberty, which often clash. Or medieval knights valuing both Christian meekness and warrior pride. These contradictions aren't necessarily flaws. Harari suggests they might be vital engines for cultural dynamism, forcing people to think critically, reconcile opposing values, and drive change.
Okay, so we have agriculture creating surplus, enabling larger societies, which are held together by these imagined orders, often involving hierarchies. But despite all these divisions, Harari argues that there's been a long-term historical trend towards the unification of humankind. How does he see that happening?
He identifies three major forces that have progressively woven together disparate human cultures into larger and larger units, moving us from thousands of small, isolated worlds around 10,000 BC towards the single global world we essentially live in today.
And those three forces are?
Money, empires, and universal religions.
Let's take money first. How does that unify?
Money, Harari argues, is perhaps the purest example of an imagined order, a product of the collective imagination. It's not inherently valuable. A dollar bill is just paper. A seashell is just a shell. Its power comes entirely from the fact that almost everyone believes it has value and is willing to exchange goods and services for it.
It's a system of mutual trust.
Exactly. He highlights two key principles: universal convertibility, the idea that money can be turned into almost anything else, and universal trust, the idea that even strangers who don't like or know each other can cooperate effectively using money. This allows for economic interaction on a massive scale, connecting people across vast distances and cultural divides.
But it can also have downsides, like eroding local traditions.
Yes, because money tends to value everything in its own terms, potentially corroding things that societies previously valued for non-monetary reasons like family bonds, honor, or local traditions. But its unifying power is undeniable.
Okay, second unifier. Empires, that seems counterintuitive, as empires often involve conquest and oppression.
They absolutely do. Harari doesn't shy away from the violence and injustice inherent in most empires throughout history. But he points out that, empirically, empires have been the most common form of large-scale political organization for the last 2,500 years.
And they tended to merge diverse groups.
Yes, by conquering different peoples and territories, empires often forcibly brought diverse ethnic and cultural groups under a single political umbrella. Over time, this could lead to the standardization of laws, languages, calendars, coinage, and the gradual emergence of shared imperial cultures.
He mentions a shift in imperial ideology, too.
Right. Early empires might have just ruled for their own glory, like the Assyrians. But later, starting perhaps with Cyrus the Great of Persia, empires began to develop ideologies claiming they ruled for the benefit of all their diverse subjects, promoting a sense of shared identity and common good, even if the reality was often different.
So a lot of what we consider our culture today might actually have roots in past empires that imposed it.
Very likely, yes. Whether it's Roman law, Chinese bureaucracy, British parliamentary systems, or the spread of languages like Spanish or French imperial legacies are deeply embedded in modern cultures worldwide. Empires brought negatives, for sure, but also sometimes fostered stability, trade, and cultural exchange, leaving behind art, architecture, and systems of governance.
Okay, so money connects economically, empires connect politically. What's the third great unifier?
Universal religions. Alongside money and empires, Harari positions religion as a crucial force, breaking down local barriers and uniting large segments of humanity under shared belief systems and codes of conduct.
This really took off after the agricultural revolution, too.
Yes, the religious revolution often accompanied the agricultural revolution. Early religions were often local, tied to specific places and spirits, but then you see the rise of religions that claimed universal truth, applicable to everyone, everywhere.
He contrasts polytheism and monotheism.
He does. He suggests polytheism, with its pantheon of gods often having limited domains and subject to a higher fate or principle, might have been inherently more tolerant than monotheism. Monotheism, with its single, all-powerful, jealous god, often had a more missionary zeal and less tolerance for competing beliefs. It also introduced the complex theological problem of evil. How can a good, omnipotent God allow suffering?
Which sometimes led to absorbing dualistic ideas,
Right.
like God versus Satan.
Exactly. Dualism, the idea of a cosmic struggle between good and evil, often got incorporated into monotheistic frameworks. But Harari's main point is defining religion broadly, as any system of human norms and values founded on a belief in a superhuman order.
Superhuman means something beyond just human whim or agreement.
Yes. It could be gods, but it could also be perceived natural laws or ideologies that claim a basis beyond mere human convention.
And under that definition, he includes modern movements like humanism.
Yes, that's another key argument. He discusses the rise of humanism in its various forms. Liberal humanism, focusing on individual rights, socialist humanism, focusing on collective equality, and evolutionary humanism, which historically included darker ideas like eugenics, but today might involve transhumanist aspirations. He argues these are essentially religions that worship humanity itself, placing ultimate value on human experience, rights, or potential.
And these humanist ideas often have roots in earlier monotheistic beliefs about the sacredness of the human soul.
He suggests there's a strong lineage there, yeah. Even secular humanism carries echoes of religious concepts about the unique value of humans.
He also touches on how scientific ideas, like race theory, were once widely accepted even by elites.
Yes, he points out that Nazi racial theories, now thoroughly debunked by genetics post-1945, were actually quite mainstream among Western elites in the early 20th century. It's a sobering reminder of how even scientific beliefs can be deeply influenced by prevailing cultural biases and imagined orders, and he notes the resurgence of interest in using biological knowledge to potentially upgrade Homo sapiens in some strands of evolutionary humanism today.
Okay, that brings us neatly to the third massive transformation. The scientific revolution starting around 500 years ago. How did this change the game yet again?
The scientific revolution marked a really fundamental shift in how humans approach knowledge and power. Harari contrasts it sharply with traditional knowledge systems, including religion.
How so? What's the key difference?
The biggest one is the willingness to admit ignorance. Traditional systems often assumed that all the really important stuff was already known, perhaps revealed in sacred texts or ancient wisdom. Science fundamentally starts from the position of, we don't know.
Ignoramus, we do not know.
Exactly. That admission is crucial. Science assumes current knowledge is incomplete and potentially wrong. Second, science relies heavily on observation and, critically, uses mathematics as its primary tool to connect observations and build theories. And third, science isn't just about understanding. It aims for utility, for power developing new technologies, new capabilities.
And the impact has been unprecedented.
Absolutely staggering. The growth in human power over nature, over ourselves in the last 500 years dwarfs everything that came before. It's driven by this scientific approach.
He uses the example of the Scottish Widows' Life Insurance Fund back in 1744. How does that fit in?
It's an early example of applying statistical methods, probability theory, core mathematical tools of science to understand and predict human phenomena, in this case, mortality rates, to create a viable financial product. It shows this new way of thinking spreading beyond just physics or astronomy.
And science gets its prestige mostly from the results,
Right.
not because everyone understands the theories.
Largely, yes. Most people don't grasp quantum physics or molecular biology, but they appreciate antibiotics, smartphones, and nuclear power, or fear it. Science delivers new powers, and that's the source of its immense authority and funding.
Which leads to that feedback loop between science, politics, and economics.
Right. Scientific breakthroughs suggest new technologies. These technologies can create economic growth or military advantage, attracting investment from governments and corporations. That funding then fuels more scientific research, seeking further breakthroughs. They feed each other.
And this kind of sustained investment in science is relatively new.
Historically, yes. For most of history, rulers and merchants didn't consistently pour resources into what we'd call R&D, believing maybe that the important discoveries had already been made or that practical invention was separate from theoretical knowledge. The idea that investing in science could yield massive returns in power and profit really took hold with the scientific revolution, and especially later.
He gives that stark example of child mortality rates even for royalty in the past.
Yeah, it's a powerful reminder of how different life was. Even wealthy, healthy royal couples routinely lost multiple children to diseases we now consider minor or preventable, thanks to scientific advances in medicine and hygiene. The impact on basic survival has been enormous.
But most scientific funding still serves other goals.
Harari argues yes. Most studies are funded not out of pure curiosity, but to achieve some political goal, like national defense, economic goal, like developing a new product, or even a religious ideological goal, though that's perhaps less direct today. Science rarely happens in a vacuum.
And this ties into the link between the scientific revolution and European imperialism. He uses Captain Cook's expeditions as an example.
Yes, Cook's voyages were explicitly scientific mapping coastlines, collecting biological specimens, observing the transit of Venus, but they were funded by the British government and Royal Navy, and they simultaneously paved the way for British imperial expansion, claiming new territories. The quest for knowledge and the quest for empire went hand in hand.
So why Europe? Why did this scientific and imperial expansion explode out of Europe rather than, say, China or the Ottoman Empire, which were powerful civilizations?
Harari suggests a couple of key factors. One was the development of this particular scientific mindset, that crucial willingness to admit ignorance. You see it literally on European maps from the period, which started including large blank spaces labeled unknown territory.
Whereas maps from other cultures often filled everything in, even if based on myth.
Right. That admission of ignorance fueled a desire to explore and discover. Combine that with the developing imperial drive, the ambition to conquer and rule those unknown territories, and you get a powerful combination.
And technology played a role, but maybe not the only role initially.
Technology was important, especially later. But early on, say with Columbus and Cortez, the technological gap wasn't always immense. What was perhaps more significant was the European mindset, the ambition, the willingness to venture into the unknown driven by the potential for discovery and conquest, and maybe a more ruthless approach fueled by different belief systems.
Columbus's voyage has become a real turning point.
Absolutely. His accidental discovery of the Americas and the subsequent rapid Spanish conquest of the Aztec and Inca empires dramatically demonstrated the potential rewards of this explore and conquer mentality. The devastation wrought largely by diseases, but also by violence and exploitation, reshaped the world.
And he contrasts this with China's maritime expeditions under Zheng He earlier.
Yes, Zheng He commanded massive fleets and explored the Indian Ocean decades before Columbus. But China lacked that same combination of scientific curiosity about distant lands and imperial ambition to conquer them. They explored, traded, projected power, but didn't seem interested in conquering faraway places like the Americas, even if they could have reached them. Their worldview was different.
It's also ironic, Harari notes, that European imperialists often ended up studying and preserving the histories of the cultures they dominated.
It is ironic. Figures like Rawlinson deciphering ancient Mesopotamian cuneiform, or William Jones recognizing the links between Sanskrit and European languages. A lot of this scholarship happened within the context of empire, funded by imperial powers, driven partly by the need to understand the ruled populations.
Okay, so science and empire are intertwined. Then comes the capitalist creed and the Industrial Revolution building on these foundations. What's the core idea here?
The absolute centrality of growth. The modern economy, unlike most pre-modern economies, is built on the assumption and requirement of perpetual growth.
Which was a new idea.
Very much so. The traditional view often saw wealth as a relatively static pie. If someone got richer, someone else probably got poorer. Being rich even carried a moral stigma in many cultures. Adam Smith famously turned this on its head.
With the idea of the invisible hand.
Right. Smith argued that individual self-interest, pursuing private profit in a free market, could lead to collective benefits and increase in the overall size of the economic pie. Greed could be good for everyone, in theory. It's a win-win idea.
And crucial to this is the idea of credit, believing in the future.
Absolutely fundamental. Capitalism runs on credit loans, based on the expectation that the future will be bigger and wealthier than the present. This trust in future growth allows entrepreneurs to invest in new ventures, which, if successful, generate profits, which validates the trust, leading to more credit and so on.
He calls it the magic circle of imperial capital.
Yeah. Credit funds, discoveries, scientific or geographic. Discoveries lead to colonies or new resources. Colonies generate profits. Profits build trust in the system, which encourages more credit. It's a self-reinforcing loop, particularly potent when combined with empire.
He contrasts how Spain funded its empire versus the Dutch.
Yes, Spain largely relied on taxing its existing wealth, which bred resentment and didn't foster the same trust as the Dutch model, which pioneered joint stock companies and relied heavily on loans from private investors who expected a return, building a system based on financial trust and creditworthiness.
But this capitalist engine has a dark side too.
Oh, definitely. Harari is very clear about this. Unrestrained market forces, driven solely by the pursuit of profit growth, can lead to monopolies, brutal worker exploitation, environmental destruction, and even horrific practices like the transatlantic slave trade, which expanded massively to meet the demand for commodities like sugar, cotton, and tobacco produced for profit on plantations. The market doesn't inherently have a moral compass.
And then the Industrial Revolution comes along and just pours fuel on this fire.
Literally. The big shift was unlocking vast new sources of energy. For millennia, human economies were based on solar energy captured by plants, wood for fuel, crops for food, animals eating plants for muscle power. The Industrial Revolution tapped into huge stores of fossil fuels, coal, then oil, then natural gas, unleashing unprecedented amounts of energy to power machines.
And this had ethical implications too, especially for animals.
Yes, industrial agriculture, which developed alongside the urban industrial revolution, applied factory line principles to animals. Harari compares the conditions in modern factory farms, extreme confinement, disregard for social and emotional needs, to the controversial Harlow monkey experiments, arguing it represents immense suffering for billions of creatures driven by economic efficiency.
And industrial farming also freed up human labor for factories.
Exactly. Fewer people needed on farms meant more people available to work in the new urban industries, enabling the Industrial Revolution to take off.
So the combined ethic becomes
Capitalist consumerist. The motto for the rich is invest, to fuel growth. The motto for everyone else is buy, to consume the products of that growth. Thrift becomes less of a virtue, consumption becomes almost a duty.
even our concept of time changed.
Dramatically. Precise, standardized time became essential with the advent of railways needing coordinated schedules. Before that, time was much more local and fluid. The adoption of Greenwich Mean Time globally was driven by these industrial and logistical needs.
And our sense of community changed too. From local ties to
what Harari calls modern, imagined communities. Traditional communities were based on intimate local relationships, mutual obligations, shared traditions. Modernity weakened these, replacing them largely with two main imagined communities: the nation, loyalty to fellow citizens you'll never meet, and the consumer tribe, identity based on shared brands and consumption patterns.
And yet, paradoxically, he notes that the decline of old empires in the 20th century was relatively peaceful compared to history.
Yes, compared to the bloody collapse of, say, the Roman Empire, the dissolution of the British, French, Soviet, and other empires, while sometimes violent, was often remarkably swift and less catastrophic than historical precedent might suggest.
And this leads to his claim about modern peace.
Right. He argues that despite the horrors of the 20th century world wars and ongoing conflicts, humankind, particularly since 1945, has arguably broken the law of the jungle that governed most of history. Large-scale international wars between major powers have become much rarer. We're living in a period of real, if imperfect, peace, unprecedented in recorded history, largely due to factors like nuclear deterrence, economic interdependence, and the declining profitability of conquest.
It's almost hard to wrap your head around that shift, given the headlines. But through all these incredible revolutions, cognitive, agricultural, scientific, industrial, has it actually made us any happier? That's a pretty fundamental question Harari asks, isn't it?
It is, and it's a question he points out historians and social scientists have often neglected. We track GDP, lifespan, technological progress, but rarely ask systematically if these things have translated into greater human subjective well-being.
The common assumption is that more power, more health, more wealth equals more happiness.
Right, but Harari finds that view unconvincing. He uses the agricultural revolution as a prime example. More collective power for the species, arguably less individual happiness for the average farmer compared to the average forager. European empires amassed huge power and wealth, but did it make the average Briton or Frenchman demonstrably happier than their ancestors or the people they colonized? Not necessarily.
So if external conditions aren't the whole story, what is? He looks at biology.
Yes, he explores the biological view. Happiness is essentially about pleasant bodily sensations, orchestrated by our internal biochemical system, hormones, neurotransmitters. This system, shaped by evolution, might be geared towards keeping us within a relatively stable range of happiness, pushing us back towards a set point after temporary joys or sorrows.
So winning the lottery or suffering an accident might only have a temporary effect on long-term happiness levels.
That's what some research suggests. Our internal biochemistry tends to restabilize, which implies that achieving lasting happiness through external achievements alone might be very difficult.
But what about meaning? He brings up the example of raising children.
Right. Studies often show that on a moment-to-moment basis, child rearing involves a lot of drudgery, stress, and unpleasant tasks that outweigh the joyful moments when measured purely by sensation. Yet most parents report that their children are a major source of happiness and life satisfaction.
Why the discrepancy?
It suggests happiness isn't just about the sum total of pleasant moments. It might be deeply linked to finding meaning and value in life, even if that involves difficulty or sacrifice. Caring for a child is seen as highly meaningful, which contributes to overall life satisfaction despite the daily grind.
And this connects to philosophical and religious views.
Exactly. Many philosophies and religions, like Buddhism, which Harari discusses, argue that true happiness, or contentment, serenity, comes not from chasing pleasant external conditions or even pleasant inner feelings, but from understanding the impermanent nature of all feelings and detaching oneself from the relentless pursuit of them. It's about self-knowledge and not identifying with fleeting emotions.
So measuring historical happiness using modern subjective well-being questionnaires might miss a big part of the picture if meaning was more central in the past.
It's possible, yes. How people in the past conceived of or valued happiness might have been very different. It remains a deeply complex and perhaps ultimately unanswerable question whether we are happier than our ancestors.
So we've come this incredible distance, transforming ourselves and the world in ways our ancestors couldn't have even dreamed of. But where are we heading next? Harari ends the book by contemplating the potential end of Homo sapiens as we currently understand ourselves. What drives that thought?
It's driven primarily by the accelerating pace of advancements in biotechnology and artificial intelligence. We're gaining unprecedented power to manipulate biology, including our own.
Things like genetic engineering, gene editing like CRISPR.
Exactly. The ability to not just cure genetic diseases, but potentially enhance human capabilities, intelligence, longevity, physical prowess. We're already seeing things like lab-grown cartilage, sophisticated prosthetics.
Bionic limbs controlled by thought.
Yes, even potentially restoring a sense of touch. And then there's the interface between biology and computing, brain-computer interfaces, research into artificial intelligence. Projects like the Human Brain Project aim to simulate, maybe even eventually replicate, a human brain in a computer.
Which raises the mind-boggling possibility of life breaking out of the organic realm altogether, consciousness in machines.
It's a possibility that scientists and philosophers are seriously debating. All of this genetic engineering, cyborg technology, AI, raises profound ethical, political, and ideological questions. Are we playing God? What are the implications for human rights, for equality, if we can create superhumans? What does it mean to be human if we can fundamentally alter our biology or merge with machines?
So Harari suggests we might be on the verge of replacing ourselves with something entirely different, potentially ending the reign of Homo sapiens that began with the cognitive revolution.
He presents it as a very real possibility, perhaps the next major revolution, potentially far more radical than agriculture or science. We are gaining the power to rewrite our own blueprint, to become the designers of the next stage of evolution. Whether we use that power wisely is the huge open question.
Wow, it's been an absolutely incredible, almost overwhelming journey to cover in this deep dive into Sapiens. From our very beginnings as just another unremarkable mammal hiding from predators.
To developing language, stories, agriculture, cities, empires, science.
And now standing at a point where we have the godlike power to reshape life itself, including our own.
Indeed. And we really hope this exploration has given you, our listeners, some surprising insights and maybe some fresh ways of thinking about this remarkable and sometimes unsettling story of human history. It really is a testament to our unique ability, born in the cognitive revolution, to create and believe in shared stories for better and for worse.
It really makes you think, doesn't it, about the responsibility that comes with that power. Given everything we now understand or think we understand about our past, the unintended consequences, the imagined orders, the pursuit of happiness, what kind of future do we actually want to build with these new abilities? That's maybe something to ponder.
A profound question to leave things on.
Definitely. Well, thanks so much for taking this deep dive with us today.
Thanks for listening.